All right. So our third speaker on this part of the panel is Moreno Di Marco. Moreno Di Marco is a conservation biologist, passionate about addressing the challenges that climate change poses to biodiversity. He's especially interested in developing quantitative technologies for addressing large-scale conservation problems and evaluating how the solutions to these problems interact with achieving other societal goals, such as food production, climate change mitigation, and improved human well-being. Since 2009, he's worked for universities, NGOs, governmental organizations across Europe and Australia, collaborating with researchers worldwide. He holds a BSc, an MSc, and a PhD in ecology, and is currently associate professor at the Department of Biology and Biotechnology of Sapienza University in Rome, in Italy. We very much look forward also to your comments, back a bit more to the scientific side. You also have 30 minutes, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks very much, and I believe the microphone should be on. Thanks very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure, a real honor to be able to speak to this interdisciplinary audience. It's really important, I guess, that we have this kind of mixed events. So we've been hearing much about the relationship between science and climate in terms of attribution of climatic responsibility. And so I would like to use my time today to talk about the consequences. What are the risks associated to climate change globally? And this is something I think which is important to understand, because it very much presents the disconnect between climate responsibility and climate risk that we are facing today. And probably this decoupling, this disconnect will be even grow in the future. So that's what I would like to talk about today, and in particular also what it means to fail international climatic commitments. I mean, we've been hearing this story about the 1.5 degree and the 2 degree, but I mean, is it a problem if we get to 1.6? Is it a problem if we get to 3? So that's what I'm going to address today. Well, first things first, this is something that is just a brief recap. Of course, you don't have to hear this again, but we live in an era of anthropogenic climate change. This has been recognized with high confidence by the IPCC panel. I'm pretty sure all of you have seen this graph on the left many times over, and that shows you the increase in global warming in the past 150 years. So essentially, you see the change in Celsius degrees since pre-industrial level. So anything positive, anything above zero means a global warming essentially above pre-industrial level, and anything below zero would be a cooling down of the system. And there is a brown line, which is essentially what's going on at the moment, and it's largely caused by human alteration of the climate system. And there is a green line, which is what would have happened without human intervention, so without the huge effect of greenhouse gas emission. So in response of this crisis, in response to the fact that, for example, the CO2 level that we have today, atmospheric CO2 concentration is the highest of the past 2 million years, we have had the Paris Agreement, and as you was saying before me, we celebrated the Paris Agreement as a victory. But of course, that's a policy victory, but because this becomes also a factual victory, we need to see whether we are actually on track to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement. So, for example, keeping the global temperature to within 1.5 degrees compared to the pre-industrial level. The current evidence is not particularly encouraging, I must say. That's one of the latest articles that was published on the subject just less than 1 year ago. And it demonstrates that we're already at probably above 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial level, and which, of course, it will be complicated in the optic of achieving the 1.5 commitment of the Paris Agreement. And as you can see, the CO2 concentration has been rampaging over the past decades, and even in recent years, despite the Paris Agreement in 2015. I guess some people might wonder, so what? Should we care about this? Is there really too much of an issue if we overshoot this 1.5 degrees? Well, mounting evidence is actually coming and being published more or less on a weekly basis that, yes, we should be concerned, because surpassing the 1.5 degree is probably going to trigger a few global systems that will generate impacts on biological system, human system, our economies, our societies, and we have been hearing some of those examples today, actually. So this paper just came out a few months after the previous one, and this is showing how exceeding the Paris Agreement, so that 1.5 degree commitment, might actually trigger so-called climatic tipping points. So it might mean that some of the biggest climatically driven system of Earth might be disrupted. They might be altered compared to what we're used to. So bear in mind, I'm talking from an anthropogenic point of view. Those systems have been changing all the time in geological times, obviously, but geological time means millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. We are changing these systems in a matter of hundreds of years, tens of years. So are we ready to, this acceleration in pace? And when I say system, I'm talking about things like the Great Barrier Reef, things like, the collapse of the boreal forest, things like the dieback of the Amazon forest. So big system that will have huge regional effect. I'm not talking about implication for a few people. I'm talking about implication for tens of millions of people connected to each of those systems. Okay. So yes, it is a problem if we do overshoot the 1.5 degree. So we've been talking about the risks, and we've been talking about the current current situation in achieving, or actually not achieving, the 1.5 degree commitment. But where are the responsibilities and where are the risks? Because those global systems that are disrupted, they very much depend on global climate circulation. They might have localized effect or regionalized effect, but they do depend on global systems. So that's where things start to get complicated, where you try to to connect responsibilities with effects and with risk. This is how inequities start to emerge and how things start to get complicated in what can be considered climate law and climate policy connected to the climate science. So here is another piece of scientific research. This one was published a few years ago. There is more recent science produced in this sense, and I think in the next session you will hear a bit more about climate attribution from some of the other speakers. But I still like this particular piece of research because, in my opinion, that's very immediate. I've heard today about complaints about the fact that climate science sometimes is complicated. I don't think it's complicated. I think it's complex, which is one thing. But papers like this one make it very easy to understand. So this paper essentially compares climate risk and climate responsibility at a national scale, at the level of countries. So on the one axis, you have climate change vulnerability. So essentially how much every particular country will be vulnerable to the effect of climate change, because the disruption of those global systems we've been talking about will be particularly affected that country. When I say on the one axis, I mean on the colored scheme, so from yellow to green. On the other axis, so from yellow to red, you have climate responsibility measured in terms of emission level. So what it means is that there is countries who are really vulnerable to the effect of climate change, and they have very low emission levels, so they have little responsibility in the alteration of the global climatic system, but they bear the bigger risk. They are the most vulnerable country. And other countries will be the opposite. So the one in red, for example, those are the countries with the highest level of emission, but they're not necessarily associated to the highest level of risk. Think of Europe, for example. Much of Europe is red. It doesn't mean we don't have climate risk, but it means, relatively speaking, we are at much lower risk of the direct impact of climate change compared to some of the tropical countries, for example, despite we are responsible. And so if you lie on the yellow line, if the country is lying on the yellow line or the green line of that color scheme, those are countries that more or less have kind of a balance between how much they emit versus how much climatic risk they have to face. And look at Africa, for example. This is pretty much all yellow and red in its central part, which means, relatively low climate emission associated to relatively high levels of risk. Some other countries, take Europe and North America, for example, those are in red, which means high responsibility of climate emission, even if the relative risk from climate-driven system and the disruption of climate-driven system is actually lower. So you can see there is a clear disconnect between who is responsible for climate change and who pays the consequences. Let me give you a precise example. Let's focus on this area right here, okay? So that would be the Horn of Africa and Arabia and the western part of India and Pakistan. And let's get back to a few years ago. It was 2018. That's a story that I'm pretty sure some of you already know, maybe most of you already know. What happened in 2018? One of those global systems that I was mentioning before was altered. So this is the effect of cyclones that affect that area. In particular, in 2018, the cyclone season was particularly intense. This was altered by climate change, and there were many more cyclones and many more intense cyclones, which means a lot of precipitation. So bear in mind, we talk about climate change in terms of aridity and temperature going up, but an equally important event is, of course, the alteration of the precipitation regime. So in this particular area, so that's more or less at the border between Oman, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, there was incredibly heavy rainfall, much higher than normal. And this happens to be an area which is the breeding ground for locusts that you can see over here. So those are animals that can exist in two states. I'm a zoologist, so I could speak for hours about that thing, but we don't have time. But just it's important to know that those animals can exist in two states: a sedentary state, which lives at low density and is not particularly dangerous, and a migratory state, and that's a pest. I mean, we have it in the Bible. Probably Sumerian civility knew the problem of locusts, so we've known that for millennia, right? So those intense cyclones actually meant that a lot of vegetation grew in that area where there is normally desertic environment, and so there was widespread breeding of locusts. They switched from the sedentary state to the migratory state, and they started to migrate. And where did they migrate? They migrate in the Horn of Africa. Remember, in the previous map, I'm talking about yellow and green countries, so countries which are not responsible for climate emission. But look at how they pay the consequences. Swarms continue to invade and spread over the course of a few months, and numerous swarms continue to invade and reinvade places like Ethiopia and Somalia and Eritrea and so on and so forth. To cut a long story short, over less than 1 year, this was a crisis. Tens of millions of people faced extreme food insecurity because of the locust invasion, and control measures for those locusts have to interest millions of hectares. Now imagine what it means economically, okay? And that's just because of one event, our alteration of the environment of that particular area driven by global change, by climate change. And so attribution is a problem, and transboundary responsibility is a problem. And I would add an additional element to this complexity, which is the element of feedback. So who's responsible, who pays the risk in the short term, and I would say who has to deal with the consequences in the long term. That's another one. So the graph here is showing you the historical, the cumulative net emission of CO2. So this is how much CO2 emission there has been in the past 150 years per region. So nowadays the situation is a bit different. So actors such as China, for example, they've become big emitters of carbon emission. But historically, if you accumulate all the carbon emission, this is how the situation would look like, with Europe and North America, for example, being the top at the top of the list in terms of climatic emission, and of course Africa being fairly low in the emission. So this is also a snapshot of responsibility, right? Who is responsible for the current CO2 level? Who is responsible for the current levels of global warming? That translates into local effect, and local effect fairly often, probably for the most part, are paid by countries which are not even highly responsible in the first place for altering the global climatic system. And I would like to add an additional element which I haven't heard so far, and that's the element of feedback. So yes, those countries will have the short-term impact, but who has to deal with the consequences in the long term? And I would say that's everyone. Because of course, when there is climatic risk in places like Africa, that more or less translates immediately into migration, because of course those people who are facing food insecurity, are facing instability, are facing unlivable condition, they will start to migrate. And for the most part, where do they migrate? Well, for example, they will migrate back to Europe, and unfortunately every year, every month, I would say, there is a new tragedy in the sea. So if you circle back, who is responsible for that? How much climate is responsible for that? And of course, I don't know much at all about climatic law and climatic policy, but I would say there is an element of climate risk which is driving those violation of human rights, perhaps. Okay. So, and I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit fast. I'm just concerned about the timing. But what are the biological consequences? The example I gave you, the one on locusts, for example, this is, to some extent, this is just a demonstration of how altering biological systems via environmental change might determine risk. But those can be interpreted in a broader context. So, for example, we can take a look at the biodiversity risk from climate change, bearing in mind that biodiversity, so, the the connection between the natural system and the living species and the diversity among living organisms is really what governs ecosystem and what determines the functionality of those ecosystems. And so if we alter the levels of biodiversity, the natural functioning of ecosystems will be altered with all the consequences that we've been talking about, and I will be showing you in a moment. So what are those biological consequences? We can take a look at the future. So far I've been talking about the past, things, climate change level happening in the past and climate change driven effect in recent times. But we can take a look at the future. For example, we can look at scenarios. I guess you're all familiar with the shared socioeconomic pathway. So those are storyline scenarios of how the climate system and the land use system can change depending on which socioeconomic direction the world is going to take. Are we going to go, for example, for a world which is driven by fossil fuel development, or are we going to go for a world which is driven by, green economy? And based on those scenarios, we are able to make prediction and projection. We can try and understand what the temperature is going to look like in 2050, what land use is going to look like in 2050, what human population density might look like. And so can we translate those scenarios into risks? So that's stuff that we have been doing as scientists and as biodiversity scientists. One seminal paper was actually produced a few years ago, that's in 2018, pretty much as soon as the shared socioeconomic pathways were presented. This is a paper presenting what biodiversity risk might be associated to different level of global warming in the future. So once again, the analysis is complex, but it's not very complicated to explain if you want to understand. So those graphs are reporting you the proportion of species of insects or vertebrates that might face high climatic risk. And you have different histograms that depends on the level of global warming that we are achieving. So, there is going to be lower risk if we achieve a 1.5 degree global warming. So that's going to be Paris Agreement compliant. And there's going to be a much higher risk if we achieve 4.5 degrees global warming, which is, of course, much, much higher than the Paris limit. And to cut a long story short, under the current trajectory, which is probably somewhere in here, around 3.2, there may be 40 to 50% of species which face high climatic risk. By high climatic risk, I mean the climatic condition within their current distribution will be substantially different in the future. Now, are those species going to be able to adapt to those new conditions? It's really hard, so that's where uncertainty and scientific uncertainty comes into the play. It's kind of hard to predict. I mean, there is, millions and millions of species on the planet. We don't know them all, and we don't know exactly how they're going to respond. But we do have some evidence that I can talk about. For example, this is an analysis that my team has done a few years ago, and this is an analysis in which we do a backcast and a forecast projection of biodiversity risk. In this particular case, I'm talking about plant biodiversity, so the diversity of plant species. And this analysis goes from the past, which is 1900, to the future, and in this case, 2050. So we translate global stressor, increasing human population, increasing land use, increasing climate change, into a risk of extinction. So the map goes from green to red, and the more red means the higher risk of extinction. You can totally see that there is a progress. So this is 1900, and then 1930, 60, 90, up to present day, and then the future projection. And you can see a parallel with human population growth. So the numbers here in bold, they tell you the human population count for Africa. So beginning of last century was 120 million. Today is 10 times that value, and it can double up again by 2050, and under certain projection it will double up once again by the end of the century. This is directly associated to a worsening of local environmental condition, land use essentially, and how that translates into extinction risk. This can be done on an even larger scale. So the map I presented you before was for Africa, but we could actually do the same analysis globally. So that's a global scale analysis, 1 kilometer resolution, and we can then condensate the analysis into the lines that you see up here. So the line is showing you that, once again, from 1900 to the future, what is the extinction risk of species. So the way you can read the line is a reduction in the probability of species survival. So if the line goes down, as you can see on this axis over here, the species survival probability will go down as well. And on the other axis, you can actually see numbers. How many thousand plant species will probably go extinct because of land use change and climate change. Remember that plant species is what we depend on. Essentially, ecosystem services are largely mediated by plant. 80% of the global living mass of the planet on the terrestrial land is plants. So I'm talking about a big risk in terms of, what really sustain our life on this very planet. up to the present day is the black line, so this is what we observed. Well, it's still a model, but it's one model based on observation. And then you have different colored line depending on which scenario we take into the future. So the red line is scenario number 5, that's high level fossil fuel use. And the green scenario is, sorry, that was the blue scenario, my mistake. And the green scenario is a sustainability one where we undergo green economic growth. So as you can see, there is a difference. The choice we make today is the socioeconomic pathway we want to undertake will make a difference in the future. Let me give you a glimpse about what might happen if the direct effect of climate change become unbearable for the species. So that's the other graph, the one on the right. So in the graph on the left, we accounted for the effect of land use change associated to climate. But if we also account for the direct effect of climate change on species, so the fact that a certain species might not survive a certain temperature, things can go incredibly worse. So this is an extreme scenario, and so this is just to give you a perception of uncertainty of how worse things can get, essentially. And this is an extreme scenario of lack of adaptability. So this is a scenario that is only going to be realized if plant species will not be able to adapt to new climate. So we do hope some adaptation will happen, but again, the reality is probably going to be somewhere between up here and up there. So we are still in the realm of tens of thousands potential extinction from climate change in the future. Another important risk is that associated to wilderness areas, so areas which are characterized by high level of naturalness, high level of ecosystem integrity, and areas which didn't suffer from human-induced alteration. So those areas today cover roughly 23% of terrestrial land, and we know that those areas have been lost at a very rapid pace in the past 20 years, mainly from land use change. Now there is an additional risk. There is a risk of climate change. So when I talk about wilderness areas, I'm talking about the big forests, for example, of Central America or Central Africa or Southeast Asia, but even the boreal forest, for example, or the big grassland environment of Australia. So those native systems that were not industrialized and altered significantly by humans. So that's a recent analysis. We've done this one just a few months ago, and we found that there is big climatic risk to those areas. So these are the best examples of intact ecosystem on the planet, which we managed to save from land use change up to the present day, and you can see them on the map up here, but they're going to face high climatic risk. But once again, it's important in the graph on the right to see the difference between the two scenarios. So this is essentially this is a projection of how much of those wilderness areas will be impacted by climate change. So this is giving you proportions, right? So it looks like by 2050, maybe anywhere between 30% and 50% of those areas will be impacted. But once again, achieving the Paris Agreement will make a difference. So the blue line means there is 15% less risk to those areas compared to the brown line, which is our current trajectory. So once again, overshooting the Paris Agreement will have a huge, measurable, predictable, projectable impact on those systems. Yes, there is uncertainty on those projections. We cannot deny that, but still we can make prediction and models. So even Paris-compliant scenarios do bear some risk with them. So you have seen it in the previous graph. Even if we stay within 1.5 degree, it doesn't mean there is no risk. It doesn't mean there is no risk of localized climatic risk, for example. But overshooting the Paris Agreement means that climatic adaptation can become really, really complicated, really, really hard. So that's why it's important to strive for Paris Agreement or as close as possible. I'm not going to go into much detail here because I'm running out of time, but when we do projection of climatic risk on biological system, one thing we can do to reduce the uncertainty is looking back instead of looking forward. So before trying and understand, for example, how climate change is going to affect species in the future, I can take those species and see what happened in the past. Because as many have argued before me, climate change has happened already. It's the pace of climate change that we are altering now, but it's not that climate was ever stable on the planet. Climate was ever changing on the planet. And so perhaps one thing we can do, and that's what we did in this other piece of research, was looking at how species have responded to past climate change. Because if we know that, if we know whether species were able to adapt to certain levels of climate change, then perhaps we can really project risk to the future in a more accurate way. And so I've taken, for example, the response of several mammal species to climate change happening in the past 6,000 years. And you can see that some species, like the Ethiopian wolf, for example, was really not able to cope with climate change. That species has undergone a shrink in its distribution. So it's, the current distribution is much smaller than it used to be because of climate change. And then there is climatic exploiter, like the coyote. So that species has gone exactly the opposite. So the species has benefited from climate change. It managed to, to even expand the range because of climate change. But if you put all this information together, we managed to do this analysis for 500 species, something like that, I believe. You can actually even come up with a graph that puts the level of climatic stability in relation to the probability of undergoing a shrink in the distribution. So that would be the purple line. Let's ignore the other lines for now. But the purple line is fairly clear. For very high climatic stability, the probability that a species will shrink its distribution is very low. But as climatic stability decreases from high, it goes low, then look what happened. At some point, shrink, the probability that species distribution collapses and shrinks over time becomes much, much higher. We even came up with a threshold of 70%. So we found that when climate stability over time is lower than 70%, most species will be unable to adapt. They will shrink their distribution over time, facing a higher risk of extinction. And so coming with this, it's a simple number, right? It was very complex to get there, but that's a simple number. And that's good because now we can use that number for future projection. How many species will face more than 70%, less than 70% stability in the future? Once again, we can project that to future scenarios. So this is the application of that 70% threshold to the global distribution of mammal species. There are 6,000 mammal species currently in the world. This is aggregated at the level of biomes, and this is showing you what happens under different scenarios. So 1.9, that corresponds to the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement, and SSP5 8.5, this is the scenario in which the global temperature will increase by 4.5 degrees. So what you can see is a much higher number of red areas under SSP5, so where we largely overshoot the Paris Agreement, compared to very, very few red area if we stay compliant with the 1.5 degree commitment. That essentially means that there is many areas which are important for mammalian biodiversity, which will be at risk if we overshoot the Paris Agreement. So let's get straight to the policy, and hopefully I'll be able to conclude in 1 minute. How do we translate all of this information into climate law? Well, first of all, I think that's an element I haven't heard yet today, but let's remember that climate law and climate policy is at the very basis of several environmental policies. And I'll give you just two examples here. We have the European Green Deal on one end, which depends on achieving the Paris commitment, and then we have the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. So if we overshoot the Paris Agreement, and we don't achieve the climatic commitment made under the Paris Agreement, how can we achieve those two policies, for example? And those are two policies which already have contrast with each other. We just last month published an analysis, for example, of the risk that a low enforcement, a non-bold enforcement of the Common Agricultural Policy will have for biodiversity. And at the moment, there is not a lot of mechanism in the Common Agricultural Policy to control for countries overshooting their climatic emission level, for example. There is not a lot of binding mechanisms in there. So climate law, in my opinion, has to be strong in this application, because otherwise we have a risk of not achieving the policy here. And as my last slide, I'll just perhaps conclude with three things. That's something I've learned today, but something that I think is probably, perhaps it will stimulate some further discussion. First thing is, I know that in the court of law, uncertainty and uncertain facts might be problematic, but that's to some extent, that's the way it is with science. Transparent reporting of uncertainty is all we can do as scientists. Quantifying risk, especially climatic risk and climatic responsibility, is complex, but once again, I don't think it's complicated. It can be done, it can be translated, in my opinion, if we all make an effort to try and understand what's the common language. And I will just conclude by saying that climate science might be faster than climate policy to some extent. There is a new article published every day, but it doesn't really matter, because climate change is going to be faster than both. And so we are going to have to deal with uncertainty and with incomplete information in the decision-making process. And sorry if I took an extra minute here, but thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.